Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Ted Kay, treasurer of the club, standing in for Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, November 5th, for today's Friday Forum. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask everyone in the room who has not already done so to please silence your cell phones permanently. Today, we will hear an analysis of our recent election results, but first, some announcements. I'd like to start by recognizing our new City Club members, Nora Michelson and Andrew Field, and if there are any other members who are here with us at a Friday Forum for the first time, would you also please rise and let us welcome you. Nora, Andrew. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. I'd also like to offer our appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support makes these time-honored City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to AARP Oregon, the law firm of Barron Liebman, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and PGE. Thank you. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. The treasurer will be very grateful. In addition to Friday Forums, City Club offers events and discussions through our Agora Committee and New Leaders Council. On November 15th, City Club's Bright Lights program, run in partnership with Portland Monthly magazine, is hosting a conversation about alternatives to the proposed Columbia River crossing. The event is free and open to everyone. Also on November 15th, City Club members are invited to join author Brian Doyle for a discussion of his new book, Mink River. Learn more about these events on our website, pdxcityclub.org. And now to today's program. Tuesday saw the close of a contentious and hard-fought election season. In Oregon and across the nation, elections were won or lost on the basis of a few thousand or a few hundred votes. At today's forum, our panel will discuss whether results of the election will mean significant policy changes or just plain gridlock. I'm pleased to welcome our speakers, Bob Moore and David Sarasohn, and our moderator, Jim Moore. In 1981, Bob Moore founded Moore Information, Inc., a full-service public opinion research firm that assists in developing political campaigns, communication strategies, and more. The company's client list includes organizations from Fortune 500 companies and national political campaigns to nonprofit organizations and local hospitals. Active in the community, Mr. Moore has served as president of the Oregon State University Alumni Association and is chair of the Portland Metro Area Salvation Army Advisory Board. David Sarasohn, in the middle, is associate editor at the Oregonian. He first joined the paper in 1983 as forum editor in charge of the newspaper's opinion section. In 1985, he was named associate editor, and the next year began writing editorials and columns. He is now an editorial writer and editorial page columnist for the paper. In 2008, he was a finalist in commentary in the American Society of Newspaper Editors contest, and his work was included in Best Newspaper Writing 2008-2009. This year, his columns on hunger won a National Headliner Award. And today's moderator is Jim Moore, who has been an independent political analyst in the Portland area since 1990. He is currently the political analyst for Coin Local 6 Television and KXL 750 AM radio in Portland. Dr. Moore teaches political science at Pacific University in Forest Grove, where he is the director of the new Tom McCall Center for Policy Innovation. So in an obscure historical joke, we note that here the Moores outnumber the Saracens. So Jim, whose joke it was, you have the floor.
I was actually going to confess that that was my joke, sorry. We're going to start out with both of our participants here giving us 5-minute overview about what the heck happened in this darn election. And if you're waiting for us to tell you what happened in the Metro President election, we don't know. It's still dead even out there. So Bob, why don't we start with you?
Okay, Jim, thank you. Nationally, what we just witnessed is our third no-confidence election in a row. Democrats lost on Tuesday. The Republicans didn't win. Republicans, of course, lost the last two elections. It wasn't a vote Tuesday for Republicans any more than 06 or 08 were votes for Democrats. But, of course, if you're a Republican today, you're feeling pretty good about things nationally, but not so good about things locally. And if you're a Democrat, it's the reverse is true. So, why? Well, it's the economy, stupid, as it was in 2008. Obama was elected because people were dissatisfied about the economy. Republicans did well this year because people were still dissatisfied about the economy. Exit polling shows 93% of the voters have a negative view of the economy, and 53% don't believe it's going to get any better in the next year. Now, the Democrats' problem is that the Obama agenda can't really be separated from the recession based on the issues they chose, which to a large extent were perceived irrelevant by a majority of voters, and in their pathway. Majorities in this country want smaller government rather than bigger government. 65% of people who went to the polls on Tuesday nationally believe the stimulus package hurts the economy. Okay. 65% of those who went to the polls Tuesday believe the Obama stimulus package either hurts the economy or doesn't make any difference. 52% of exit poll voters believe Obama's policies hurt the country today. And this election on Tuesday was the highest number of voters who told exit pollsters that they were voting against the president in any other election. More said they were voting against Obama in this midterm than said they were voting against George Bush in the 06 midterm. And then the final statement about current perceptions of the president, Doug Schoen, a Democratic pollster, released a poll last week asking people who was the better president. 48% said George Bush, 43% said Obama. So what happened, what caused this, what in the electorate, what was going on? Independents this year voted for the Republican candidate for Congress by a 55 to 39% margin. In 2008, they voted for the Democrat by a 57 to 39% margin. Republicans and Democrats both voted for their own party member by 90% plus, but in both years. So basically what happened is that independents went from supporting Democrats to supporting Republicans, basically in the same percentages. Other things, the Democrat base nationally didn't turn out. Much lower turnout among the 18 to 29s, among union households, and among African Americans. Now, let me move to Oregon for a minute. Oregon, as they used to say in state tourism, things look different here. Again, going to exit polls. Nationally, Republicans versus Democrats, there was no difference. Equal percentages, 36% on each side. In Oregon, Democrats had a 9-point advantage. Again, these are people who showed up at exit polls. In Oregon, people who voted on Tuesday said they voted for Obama in 08 by a 17-point margin, the same margin they voted for Obama in 2008, which means basically the electorate that showed up in 08 in Oregon was the same group that showed up 2 years ago. Nationally, it was the tie between Obama and McCain. So that was a different electorate because, as you recall, Obama beat McCain by 6 points. This year's electorate was tied, so it was a different electorate nationally It wasn't so in Oregon. And then lastly, in Oregon, 28% of the voters say they're liberals, nationally 20%. So you can see with that data that we have, as I said, things look different here. Another piece of interest, to me at least, in 2008, 11% of the voters in Oregon were non-white. This year, 16% were non-white. There was a growth in minority vote between 2008 and 10. That's unusual. Generally speaking, the minority voters show up in smaller numbers in midterm elections, but that didn't happen in Oregon. Didn't happen in California or Washington either, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why the left coast, so to speak, stayed blue while the rest of the country was red. Couple notes on the governor's race. Chris Dudley, among white voters, he won 50-49. Among minority voters, he lost 42-57. Republicans have a serious problem long-term if they don't address this. On issues, last week we asked voters a series of questions about which candidate for governor would do the best job on a variety of things. Dudley had a wide edge over Kitzhaber on will cut spending and taxes. Dudley led Kitzhaber by 3 points on more likely to create jobs and more likely to improve schools, which was frankly a surprise to me. For a Republican to lead a Democrat on improving schools, that's basically unheard of. But on a question of who's more qualified, Kitzhaber had a big lead. So with that, I will stop, David, and let you take over.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I've been placed here on a very daunting panel. I tend to think of this as more and less. But if I'd known the theme, I'd have done more on my medieval Muslim material, which, believe me, kills. As many of you might know from reading my column, this was not my favorite election. A gain of more than 60 seats for Republicans in the House of Representatives essentially qualifies as a 100-year flood. And you have to go back to things like 1920, 1894 to see things like this. And back in that election, one Republican commented that the Democratic losses would be so heavy they would be buried in trenches and marked unknown. And I think we got pretty close to that this year. Now, with the addition of the House, there were 6 Republican gains in the Senate, which in the body which can barely operate with 59 members of one party, with 53 members of one party, is going to move to entire paralysis. Now, this is the point where I'm supposed to say, but if you're a Democrat, it's okay because. No. I don't think there is much of a comforting note on this point. And in fact, I think the more you go into this, the more discouraging this outcome becomes. Now, across the country, Republicans picked up 700 state legislature seats. They now control the state legislature in most of the major states. And next year is going to be reapportionment, meaning the effect of this election is going to be felt at least a decade down the road. In all of what we've come to think of as the major swing presidential states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, plus Wisconsin, plus Virginia, plus Iowa, there are now Republican governors, which is an enormous convenience to a Republican candidate for president. 2 years ago, most of those places had Democratic governors, and that was a great assistance to Obama. Now, we've seen a development in this election, the Citizens United development, about large amounts of money which can't be traced or connected, playing a huge role in this election. And you have to feel that that's only going to increase because, what we've seen about money patterns in elections, once something has started, it tends to build. Once people have built the pattern, it tends to intensify. And you can only imagine that for 2012, what I would really like to be is a television station. So none of those are encouraging, and the idea is, where does Obama go now? Because from this point, what happens with the economy is going to be very mixed from his perspective. If there is some kind of beginning of a recovery in the next 2 years, it's going to be more difficult for him to take credit for it. If things continue badly, hey, he owns it. So I think the next step, the next posture for him is a very difficult one to lay out at this point. So, is there any point where you can say, but it's okay? Well, it's sort of okay living here. Not so much because Democrats retain the governorship, because Democrats retain the state Senate, but because of both the closeness of this race and also because of the way it was run. I mean, there were two candidates for governor, both of them essentially running from the center. Now, when you look at the Oregon state legislature, it's closely divided, but it doesn't have quite the poisonous partisanship that you see in Congress at this point. There are people in both houses who are accustomed to working with the other side. And I think there might actually be a chance to achieve more in Salem over the next 2 years than there will be a chance to achieve in Washington. Now, the other thing, and you have to say that things change very quickly, which is something we can see, as Bob was pointing out. You look at this year compared to last election. Attitudes change, the possibilities change. After the '94 election, I was speaking to Jim McDermott, surviving Democratic congressman from Seattle, and asking him how he was managing to stay sane. And he said, well, one thing you learn in the Pacific Northwest is the tide comes in, the tide goes out. And I think we're also at a point now when you look at our media, when you look at the level of microphones that various players have, when the tide can move even faster. So it's very hard to see where we're going to be in 2 years, even with these directions. And when I look at them, the prospects down the road and the prospects for 2012, I don't expect that to be my favorite election either. But I do think that I'm probably going to be feeling less terrible about it afterwards, and sometimes less is more. Thank you.
We'll try to get all the puns out of the way. I'd like to start the questions by looking at the national scene. This is the first time that we've had the House switch, but not the Senate. So yes, the Democrats lost seats in the Senate, but the Democrats still control the Senate. Patty Murray added to that number just yesterday. And so we've heard John Boehner, the presumptive Speaker of the House, talk about a mandate for change from across the country. Is that what the message of the voters was, with the House going one way and the Senate staying Democratic? Start with you, Bob.
Well, if we look at the losses Democrats took, I think, yes, there is people are mad about the economy. They're upset, they're fearing about the economy. And that was the reaction. That's why people voted the way they did. They didn't see that any steps had been taken to fix things. And so, yes, I guess you could say they want change. They're not satisfied with what we got. They didn't find the progress that the president said that would be there.
Well, I think you'd have to say that John Boehner is the person who can claim the most momentum at this point, and I'm sure he intends to use it. And he has at this point more members of the House than the Republicans ever had during their entire 95 to 2007 stretch. So he also has what's likely to be a more ideologically unified group. So I think he's going to be passing a great many things. Now, in this past session, the House passed 420 bills, which the Senate never took up at all, and I think we're likely to see that pattern continue.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people, when they're looking at this, are thinking that there may be just a 3-month and possibly 6-month window for any meaningful legislation to get through Congress, and all of a sudden the 2012 election just takes over. And so we're going to be watching that very closely to see what happens with that. Oregon's place in the new Congress. I mean, our Democrats kind of go to the sidelines, and all of a sudden Greg Walden, who every day seems to be moving higher and higher up the hierarchy in the House. What does this new Congress mean for Oregon? David, let's start with you.
Well, clearly it's better to have 4 members in a Democratic House than 1 member in a Republican House. Walden is in a influential position, although it's sometimes a little hard to see what it is. He's a member of the leadership, but his title isn't specifically defined. But I think he's going to be an influential player for us. But on the other hand, there's a loss from Earl Blumenauer, who is a rising member of Ways and Means, and now he's on the short side of that. We have the major loss of Peter DeFazio, who was chairman of the Surface Transportation Subcommittee, which is the largest and one of the most spendy subcommittees in the House. And now that's gone. I mean, he has advanced to be the ranking minority member on the entire Transportation Committee, but I think that's probably sort of cold comfort for him. So I think our position is indeed weakened. I mean, we still have 2 members in a majority Democratic Senate, including the Finance Committee and including Wyden's position as chairman of the Forestry Subcommittee. But on the other side of the Capitol, we're in a bleaker space.
I'd have to agree mostly with David. I think that, obviously the 4 congressional Democrats are much less powerful. I expect some great things out of Walden, though. He has some very sound ideas about how to make the process work better. More time spent discovering what's in bills. He's very process-oriented, and I think that will benefit the country and the state if he is listened to and gets his word through.
Okay. Let's shift to Oregon. We had a heck of a governor's race. We're finally able to figure it out. It was interesting. I was doing all my math on the back of television scripts, trying to figure out how many votes could possibly be out there. And we didn't really know, but here's the trick. The Secretary of State has put up a wonderful site that has, in effect, live votes. It and AP more or less agreed throughout the night. Some counties lost their computers, so they couldn't feed into one or the other. We couldn't figure out how many votes were still out there with a great degree of accuracy. The New York Times came to my rescue. The New York Times had live stuff on all the Senate races in the country, and you could go click on a state and click on a county. And that's what actually gave me the best estimate of how many votes were still out in Lane County, Multnomah County, that kind of stuff. So for all of you who want to follow along at home next election, go look at the New York Times site for trying to figure those kinds of things out.
But someday we will get the Oregon Live site working.
Exactly. Exactly. So this governor's race, so close, the Democrats win yet again. Is Oregon turning purple again? Is this a sign of it was a down year for Democrats and that's why Dudley did so well? Bob, why don't you give us a little bit more than what you talked about at the beginning on this governor's race?
Well, I mean, as I said, structurally, Oregon definitely leans toward the Democratic side, as does Washington and California. That's where they're called the left coast. And if you go back 20 years, it's more Democratic than it was, even when there were wider margins, more Democrats registered than there is today. what's going to happen in the future? You know, we've got some new people in the state, Republicans have some new people in the state legislature, which I think is going to help strengthen their bench. They're going to have to be listened to in Salem, more so than they were last time. They're going to be players for sure, where basically last time they just sat around and let the world go, but there wasn't much they could do. So they're going to have more influence. The question is, do they understand, you know, when it's, you know, that the people are looking for problem solvers instead of dividers? And, you know, with a new bench, and if they come across as problem solvers, I think there's some potential for Republicans, you know, in the future to do well. But, I mean, it's not going our way certainly right now, and with the growth of minority voters in the state, you know, they're going to have to address that too, or they're going to be left further out in the cold.
I'd just like to follow up a bit. If you look at the last 4 elections, we haven't had people from that bench in 3 of those. We've had Chris Dudley, Ron Saxon, and Bill Sizemore. And so on the Republican side, I mean, in effect, it looks like a lot of the train of training, you know, the Bob Packwood model, in effect. You come up through the legislature, you then begin to look out there, and you begin to run for those higher offices. It looks like it's broken. So you see that truly actually coming back into play.
Yes, I think that's what I'm most, as a Republican, that's what I'm most encouraged about what happened in Oregon, is the building of the bench in the state legislature.
Okay. David?
Well, I think the question of the bench is vital, because Republicans don't have it and haven't had it for a while. And if you look now at the position of the statewide elected offices, you know, Secretary of State, Attorney General, Treasurer, I mean, those are all Democrats, and that's been traditionally the place where we find people to go up to the next level. And I think also that you look at the last Republican success around here, the election of Smith. Smith came into the legislature and he was on track and he was expected and it was assumed that he was going up there. It's harder to find people like that now. And I think the other difficulty for Republicans, aside from a greater diversity of the electorate, which they haven't been able to deal with, is problems with the suburbs. I mean, 20 years ago, Washington County was a Republican stronghold. I mean, now Washington County is mostly a Democratic county. And I don't know how there's a way to get around that, but I think as Multnomah County becomes bluer and bluer, there needs to be something to oppose that, and it's not clear what that is. You know, for this year, I mean, Chris Dudley was almost the ideal candidate. He's attractive, he's smart, he's well-known. He was an outsider in a time when people distrust everything. No, I think there's a reason that he did that well. And when you look further down, you can't see who the next one would be, but 4 years ago, you wouldn't have seen Chris Dudley.
Just so you know, one of the great things I get to do at COIN is I call all of the races. And at 8 o'clock, we, for the first time, had a good electronic connection to the different counties, and so we had numbers right at 8 o'clock. In the past, that's cell phone calls in, somebody has to type it into the computer, and it's like 8:07 or 8:10 before you get any numbers. The Multnomah County numbers came up, Dudley had about 27, 28%. If he had had 33% or more, I would have called the race right there. Because when you look at Republicans who are successful, there's kind of a 30% range. If you get that in Multnomah County, you're looking pretty darn good. If you're above 30%, you're basically going to win. So he was really, really close. We knew that right from the beginning, just waiting for the rest of the state to come in. I'd like both of you to comment on the ads that we heard this election cycle. I don't know about you guys, but you know, besides the stuff happening on television, I live in Washington County, in one of those places that is registered Democrat, but actually went for Republican this time. There was one particular day when I got 14 different mailers. Then I thought we were done about a week ago, and lo and behold, last Saturday, I got 8. We were averaging 5 a day for about 3.5 weeks. And boy, they were nasty. There were sales taxes and trips to Hawaii and all sorts of things going on there. But comment on the advertising and what it contributed to our conversation in this election. Bob, why don't we start with you?
Well, like David said, I'd like to own a TV station. The ads, there's a lot of them. I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. There's a lot of them, obviously. There's a lot of money in the system which allows them to be sent out and to be on TV. The quality of the advertising is higher than it used to be in terms of the production values. They're coming from all, not just the candidates. I mean, the biggest growth is not from candidates, it's from independent committees. And that's probably only going to grow given the way the law is set up these days. So we can look for more of the same, maybe even a few more. We just can hope that the production value is worth looking at.
So what do you think that it added to the voters' decision-making process? I mean, so many of them seem to be trying to define the opposition and scare people. What do you think that did as people sat down with their voters' pamphlets or with a stack of mailers? What effect do you think it had?
Well, the reason people use negative advertising is that it works. And, everybody deplores it, but it moves numbers. I was thinking about this, and it seems to me there's sort of a connection between, negative advertising and porn. I mean, nobody out there says, I really enjoy porn, and I go and seek it out whenever I can. And yet somehow it's a major market in this country. And I think it's just the same kind of thing with negative TV spots. And there's a reason why people put their money in it. There was an event this year in Colorado where there was an appearance of the Democratic senator who managed to get himself narrowly reelected after spending a vast amount of money, most of it saying nasty things about the Republican candidate. And people said, well, we hate these negative ads. Why do you people do them? And he said, well, before I did them, I did $1 million worth of positive ads about myself, and none of you noticed it. So I think this is just what moves voters. This is what voters notice, and I don't think there's any reason to think it's going to change.
I have to say that my favorite ad was in the Jamie Herrera-Denny Heck race up in Washington State. I loved the looks back at the 70s to see what different hairstyles were and what Denny Heck was doing during those go-go times. There was some good music there, especially if you like Saturday Night Live.
What I liked about those ads is that both of them were pounding on the other for being a Washington, D.C. creature, and neither of them had ever been to Washington, D.C. But
Exactly.
the other thing about those ads, and this applied to the ads in Oregon congressional races too, which is that the nastiest ads come from the national campaign committees, the DCCC, the NRCC. And, those ads are put together by people who basically are sitting in a dark room in Washington, D.C., processing film as fast as they can and beaming it out to Oregon television stations. They've never seen Oregon. They never have to look at the people they're campaigning against. And, it's just sort of these competing slaughterhouses.
Jim, I'll tell you one thing. Right now, the bulk of the advertising in these highly competitive races is from independent committees, as opposed. So how do you fix that? You raise the limits for congressional and Senate races. Right now, maximum is $2,300 a person. Raise it up to $10,000, raise it up to $20,000. I mean, then you're going to start seeing ads from the candidates. Instead, you're going to reduce the importance of independent committees.
And just to keep in mind that when we look at some of the races, like the congressional race up in Washington, and to a certain extent the race in the 5th congressional district here, outside money was about, in some cases, 50% more than the amount of money the two candidates raised. So in fact, there are two different campaigns going on, which leaves some of us kind of confused. Let's look at ballot measures in Oregon. You know, we've had all sorts of exciting things that have led the world. The Pope knows where we are because of assisted suicide, and this time, kind of a quiet ballot measure season. What did you see out there for the ballot measures, David?
Well, I think the thing that truly surprised me was the defeat of voter-owned elections in Portland, which just seemed like the ideal Portland program. And I don't even think there was any organized group against it. And yet, people just looked at it and decided that wasn't what they wanted to spend money on. And I would like to think, of course, that this is the extraordinary influence of the Oregonian editorial page. But I think maybe this is the legacy of Emily Boyles reaching down 4 years and now 2 states away. So.
My comment on the casino measure, those guys needed good polling. If they would have done something up front, they knew the thing was going to lose.
That's the good short answer. And interesting, the casino measure was really the only one that had really an advertising presence at all. They kept wrapping the Oregonian. But it was amazing to me how there were all these ballot measures and they just got completely lost in the campaigning that was going on for candidates this year. Compare that to all those people wondering if they were going to have good marijuana down to the south of us in California, and to the north of us they had income taxes and repealing candy taxes and all sorts of things. You know, I think we may be at the low end of a cycle here in Oregon in ballot measures. Let's look at the Oregon legislature a little bit more. We've got a split there. We've got in party control, and then within the House itself, the governor-elect yesterday was talking about we have to come at this and work together. He says he learns from his years as the governor, working with the Republicans at that point. The Republican leaders and Democratic leaders in both houses have said, yes, we can't repeat the sins of the late 90s and early 2000s when we kept having partisan train wrecks. Give a real assessment. What do you think really will happen? Bob, let's start with you.
So ask me a tough question.
It's my job.
What will happen? Let me paint you a rosy scenario. Both sides figure out that they need each other to get along, and so they come up with a series of proposals that nobody totally agrees with, but advances the future of the state. We're not as encumbered by the Tea Party movement here as they are nationally. People still get along a little better than they do in D.C. They get along better in Salem. You know, the Democrats and Republicans, I mean, if they want to get ahead from their own personal, and there's some Republicans down there and some Democrats that want to be statewide office holders someday, it would, you know, make sense for their own personal advancement if they can figure out how that they solve problems instead of starting fights and not getting along.
Well, a few months ago, we had a conference in Portland of state budget officers, and I went down to bother them. And I was talking to one of them, and I said, you know, it must be really hard to be a state budget officer in times like this. And she said, no, actually, it's easier. When there's no money, there's no money. And I think that's going to be a considerably simplifying effect in this session of the legislature, that there's just going to be no money. This is going to be a matter of how much you cut rather than how much you add, and I don't think anybody is going to be eager to have their individual fingerprints on the outcome without other folks involved. You know, the last time John Kitzhaber was governor, we used to go through these months-long wrestling matches in the legislature about funding, and then we'd get to the May forecast and $500 million would fall out of the sky and that would solve everything and people would go home. Everybody knows this isn't going to happen this time, and I think because of that, there is indeed going to be a somewhat more serious, a somewhat less hostile approach to putting these things together.
Great. Let's switch and go to our board host for a question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. I want to note for the radio audience that all of our speakers are wearing red ties. So the first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host. Our host today is City Club Governor Barnes Ellis. Barnes is a partner at the law firm of Stoll Reeves, where he practices business litigation, and he's general counsel of Mercy Corps. Barnes previously served as a member of the City Club Board of Governors in the 1970s and has served on 2 City Club study committees relating to city governance. Barnes is wearing a dark gray tie. Barnes?
So this job of board host is very hazardous because you never know when the questions you came prepared to ask are going to be preempted. And it gets worse when you have a panel and a very astute questioner. So I had 3 questions thinking, I'll be safe with that. All 3 have already been answered. So I'm going to ask a question that's the 4th question. State employees and their union have become one of the best funded, most powerful forces in state government. And we face a $3 billion projected deficit. Many people think PERS reform has to be part of the solution to that problem. And my question to you is, will the new governor stand up to the state employees?
David, why don't you take a first shot at that?
Well, both candidates for governor talked about this, talked about limiting state employee benefits, limiting state employee salaries. Now and it was actually Kitzhaber's claim that he would be in a stronger position to do this because he was supported by the unions and he could go at them with somewhat more trust. He also announced proudly that in his first term in 1995, there was a state employees strike, which is not something people usually take credit for. You know, on PERS itself, there are very specific limits coming out of a state Supreme Court decision for what you can do with people who are on PERS Tier 1. So I'm not sure how much more you can do with that. There are things you can do about the 8% guarantee. There are things you can do about the pickup. I don't think any of these are likely to be great amounts of money. You could start an additional tier for people hired after 2013. But I think the money that you're going to find in state employees is going to come more out of salaries and more out of medical coverage than it's going to come out of PERS.
So this question reminds me of the question when they asked the bank robber, why do you rob the bank? That's where the money is. So why do you look at PERS reform and salaries and state benefits and wages? Well, that's where the money is. You've got to look at it. If you're in a $3 billion deficit, you've got to look at it. And maybe constitutional change is going to be required. Will the voters go with that? Perhaps. But it's absolutely necessary.
Great. So let's take our first question from the crowd.
We'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. If I flash this question mark card, it means please make it a question and please wrap it up. Thank you. Your first question.
Yes, I'm Arnold Kogan, member of the club. And my first question is primarily to Bob Moore, but the rest of the panel can respond as well. Bob, in your analysis, you didn't mention one factor that I thought you might comment, and I'd like to hear about it, at least when you were citing national data about the outcome of the election. So to what extent do you think racism should be taken into consideration in the anti-Obama part of the vote?
Very little, Arnold. I don't think racism has much of anything to do with anything going on in the country today.
Well, I don't think the race is a particular factor here. I think this Muslim undercurrent is really something driving a lot of people. And I think when you get a situation and you look at the signs that appear at various rallies and you see Rush Limbaugh referring to the president as Imam Obama, I think there is a certain distrust out there. And when you find that 19% of the people out there think the president is Muslim, I think that is a situation which unsettles his standing somewhat.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was, the Sunday Oregonian had an editorial that said, wars? What wars? And it also speculated on the fact that in this election, there has been no candidate, no place where this issue was raised. And yet these wars are devouring our money and some of our lives too. What the hell is going on, in your opinion?
I think that's a great question. And it was also a great editorial. But we've gotten to a remarkable position in this country where we're fighting these two major wars, and they're sort of the concern of 3% of the population, and the rest of us sort of don't bother to think about it. I mean, sure, we know there's people over there, and every so often we see a face come up on the news that somebody from Hood River was blown up in Afghanistan, and that's too bad. But it's not really anybody we know. And somehow this entire thing has passed out of our general consciousness, and I think it is in many ways an atrocity. I mean, part of the problem here, part of the problem that neither side had much to say about the wars is that neither side knew what to say. Nobody could say what they would do differently if they were in power in the week after that. And I think all you can do is to keep bringing it up and to keep it in front of people's faces and make people try to think about it.
I think that did have a little bit to do with voter turnout. I mean, Obama's base is the least supportive of the war, and I know in that base there is quite a few people disappointed in his views on what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think that's another thing that's hurt him with the electorate.
Hi, I'm Jerry Cohn. I'm also a City Club member. The rhetorical question I have is, will the spirit of Ben Westland bring a new spirit of cooperation in the Oregon legislature? More to the point, we're looking at a legislature, as we know, and a governor dealing with a huge deficit, or projected deficit in terms of need. What do both of you see in terms of tea leaves of either the competing interests of potential kids K through 12 versus seniors and disabilities versus public safety, as opposed to some way that we actually look at the whole without divide and conquer? So I'd love your reactions as to how we how this might sort through. See if I get I was waiting for the question mark.
Well, I think in that aspect of it, this is going to be a very brutal kind of session, because each interest group has its own claims. Traditionally, K-12 has done particularly well for obvious reasons. There's going to have to be some money coming out of that. The question of taking money out of human services becomes more complicated because so much human services money is on federal match, and if you save one state dollar, you're costing yourself 3 federal dollars. We've got this issue about corrections, which goes higher and higher whatever the economic situation is. And one thing that slid through in this election when nobody seemed to mind was the idea of increasing minimum sentences for certain drunk drivers and certain sex offenders, and that's going to be another $10 million bite out of it. You know, a concern that bothers me particularly is that the last 3 times that we've been in this kind of economic trouble, higher education has gotten hit first and hardest, and I think that that's going to be a very short-sighted approach. So this is going to be, I think, a major battle among the interest groups, maybe even more than among the parties.
I think everything is going to be cut, though.
If I could add a little bit, there's going to be an interesting dynamic. Once again, I live out in Washington County. The Republican who won in my district, Sean Lindsay, specifically said that he wanted to prioritize spending on K through 12 first. And so that's a dynamic that we haven't necessarily heard expressed on the Republican side of the aisle with a great deal of forcefulness, but it would change some of the dynamic, what's going on in the legislature. I tend to agree with what David said earlier, though. You know, the lack of money is going to focus a lot of people a lot, but we'll wait and see what happens. In the past, what would happen is these interest groups would collide. The legislative forces behind them would collide. However, when you're looking at what's going on right now in Salem, will they, after the House figures out who runs the darn House, will they start having meetings, say 3 weeks from now, to try to figure out, can we put together an overall budget that looks at these things not as competing interests, but as parts of the whole and trying to prioritize that? We'll be able to tell fairly quickly if they're going to be able to do that.
Leslie Johnson, City Club member. I want to ask about the prospect of initiative reform. You mentioned already that the ballot measure activity for this election was a little bit quieter than some other years, and initiative reform has been one of the things that's come up in the past when the legislature doesn't have money to plan on spending. This is an area that they could devote energy to that wouldn't cost necessarily any money. I wonder if you sense any willingness on the part of Oregonians to be more accepting of some reform in this area than they have been in the past, and if so, what do you think the priorities or the areas with the best prospect for being successful are?
You know, when you ask voters questions about initiative and referendum reform in polls, you always get like a 40% don't know. It's an issue that doesn't have a great deal of saliency with voters. And as a result, politicians don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And the past attempts, of course, have usually gone down in the flames because it's easy to characterize it one way or another because the undecided levels or unknown level is so high. I frankly don't expect to see much.
I wouldn't either. You know, Oregonians cherish their right to vote even on things they don't know anything about. And I don't think they're going to be open to changing that.
Yeah, the key thing with this issue is we didn't just have a train wreck. This last initiative round, we didn't have big, huge problems with gathering the signatures or any of that kind of stuff. So without that recent train wreck, I don't think there's really any impetus in the legislature to deal with this at all.
Ken Ray, City Club member. I'm going to ask the question that Jim said not to ask at the beginning. I work on the communication staff at Metro, so I'm curious, based on the numbers you've seen and the numbers reported in the Oregonian this morning, who you think my next boss is going to be, how soon you think we're going to know that, but also based on the results in this election, what do you think the voters were responding to in the messages of the two different candidates, jobs versus how we plan for growth in the region? What do you think resonated with voters? What do you think we still have left to figure out?
I can't give you employment advice here. You know, I think at a certain point, you know, even among, 350,000 votes cast, a 300-vote lead starts to look big. And that's as far as I could go on this. I think what's striking about this, and this is something that we anticipated all along, is the difference among the counties. I mean, there is a very strong, green impetus out there from Multnomah County behind the Stacy candidacy. There's a much more skeptical economic development priority out of Washington and Clackamas counties that was driving the Hughes candidacy. And whichever one of these guys actually ends up winning, he's going to find the challenge, which is always the challenge of Metro, to bring those two together and to get a single metropolitan area priority list.
As to when you find out who your new boss is, basically they will do a recount on this. It's well within the 0.2%. And so it'll be about a day after they start the recount, which should be in about 2.5 weeks, 3.5 weeks.
So be nice to everybody.
Exactly. Question.
Hi, Joyce Cresswell, City Club member. This question is for David. I, too, got a lot of mail, and most of it went directly into the recycle, so I didn't really look at it. But the thing that concerned me was the advertising supplement that the Oregonian published. And it wasn't a wrap. It was published like a section. And it said advertising supplement on it. And of course, we couldn't tell who paid for it. I looked and looked. I know the name of the local agency that sponsored it, but we don't know who paid for it. So my question is, will you tell us who paid for it? And also, what was the editorial discussion about publishing an advertisement that looked like it was written and prepared by the Oregonian?
Well, this was not an editorial board decision. I mean, this happens above my pay grade. But I think our feeling is that if it says advertising supplement, just as when we put out these other things that say advertorial, that we have made the statement about who's behind it, and it isn't us. And what we do, the business we are in, is selling advertising. And we will sell it to people who are prepared to buy it. We will make it as clear as we can that we were not the people putting it together. But this comes up essentially in every election. We had people the last time around complaining about our use of the spadilla, or use of the wrappers around the front page, and this is an advertising medium. And I would say that considering what a minimal percentage of political advertising money we actually get, it sort of hurts my feelings that we've got that question, but thank you.
Albert Starr, City Club member. A question came up at our table. You've mentioned about the net changes in Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature and in the Congress. Could you please address the net change in the number of women sitting in the legislature and in the Congress?
I know the number of women in Congress has declined this year, first time in 30 years or so. I don't know the exact numbers, and I couldn't give you a count in the legislature.
Paul Milius, club member. Is there any chance that this balanced, sort of evenly divided legislature is going to do anything about reforming the idiotic tax structure of this state in its many variations, kickers, and reliance on the income tax, et cetera?
If I could jump in on that first, I think the answer is no. And the reason is very simple. A, they've got a lot of budgets to cut. And B, this usually takes a discussion that has gone on for years over legislative sessions. And if we're in that conversation, we're in the middle of it. I'm not convinced that we're in the middle of it, that there's a real conversation going on. But it just takes a long time to think about this thing. And think about the campaign. If you wanted to tar your opponent, you just use the word sales tax. And do we need a sales tax? Well, we can't even have a conversation about it. So until we're at the stage we're going to have a conversation, we're not going to have reform, and I don't think we're there at this point.
I would say no chance the legislature's going to do anything. No chance the voters will approve anything. So what's so idiotic about it?
I'd say that anything that happened would be fairly minimal. I mean, I think there may be some adjustments to the capital gains tax, but I think anything more ambitious than that is a fight this legislature doesn't want to borrow.
Thank you. We have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Join us next week for a discussion of nonprofits and their role as a lifeboat in a sinking economic ship. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guests, Jim Moore, Bob Moore, and David Sarasohn. We are adjourned.